it's funny when you look at it, like a one-person show has one actor, but there's probably a whole army of technicians that have worked on putting that production on stage. There's not a lot of people that know what we do and see it as a pathway towards a career and a lifetime of, really interesting, stimulating, and rewarding work. There's a very large number of people involved in any single production that goes on Broadway that people typically don't know anything about. And there's way more work backstage than there is on stage in most instances.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your access and connection to the live performing arts. In this podcast, you'll hear from some of the industry's most inspiring people from around the globe who create magic on stage and backstage. Our guests share their knowledge, passion, and the real stories of how a show comes together. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the StageLync podcast, your connection to the performing arts. My name is Ana Aguilera. You can learn more about us on Instagram at StageLync. Today we're talking with Dan Hanessian. Dan has been a professional theater technician and professor for over 30 years. His work has included Broadway, film, television, opera, dance, theme entertainment, Las Vegas spectaculars, live events, and a host of other productions. This range of experience provides them with a unique perspective on problem solving and how to work collaboratively. These skills, combined with a deep understanding of how the industry works, allow him to train up-and-coming technical directors and production managers in a way that prepares them for careers in all areas of entertainment industry. Hi, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
It's an honor to have you. All right, so I've read your bio, but in your words, how do you end up in Purchase and teaching students and working? Well, this is something that's very interesting because you've really covered a lot, if not all the genres, most of the genres in entertainment. So how do you get there?
Good fortune and being in the right place at the right time. I started off actually doing theater when I was in first grade, backstage in the cafetorium, turning the light switches on and off, and have done technical theater my entire life. I did a little bit of acting just because I felt it was, when I was an undergrad, I actually started off as a marine biologist. Thought I was going to be diving on oil rigs, writing environmental impact statements, but ended up getting to organic chemistry and going, I've been doing theater all my life. Why don't I do that? So I was at a little liberal arts college in Maryland, in Southern Maryland. They had a theater BA. I was there for 4 years. Graduated and then realized that I was not going to be prepared for a professional career with just a BA. And also I had planned on teaching all along because I've been also teaching for a long, long time as well. So I wanted to get a graduate degree. I happened to have a technical director at St. Mary's, which was the undergrad, that said, there's this place called Purchase. You should look at them. And so they did not have particularly good advertising at the time. So I applied to Purchase. I applied to a couple other schools, got into Purchase and thought, I want to go where Broadway is. I'll learn there and then probably go off to some little theater in the Midwest, work my way towards the coast. But things just happened to work out. And I went from being a grad student. And at the time that I was there, computers were just starting to be used. And when I graduated, I was the only person around that actually knew how to do AutoCAD and teach it. So they asked me back as an adjunct the following year. I was also working in a commercial scene shop called Showtech, and then was doing both of those for a little while. And then the following year, they offered me a full-time job to teach, and I've been there ever since.
I want to go back to your marine biology. We should go diving someday. I don't think I would do the northeast coast though.
I went as far as an advanced open water scuba diving license. I did my checkout in a freshwater quarry with a thermocline at 30 feet, and it was cold. So yeah, I jokingly say that I actually applied to FSU in Tallahassee because it's right near the Gulf, and I figured I could do theater and I could scuba dive. in warm water because, boy, once you do a checkout in the Northeast, it's I didn't need to do cold water diving ever again. So
I don't think I need to do cold water diving ever, but
no,
we'll see. But I can tell you by experience, you can do theater and diving at the
yeah.
same time.
If I had known back then, it could have been a completely different career path. So
Yeah, you can still come and see the shows.
exactly,
Maybe
exactly.
dive, maybe see underwater. But yeah, we should go see some big mammals or some sharkies. They're fantastic. Okay. Enough of me digressing. um so you it's funny that you started teaching AutoCAD, and I don't think, maybe it's very geeky and techy of me, but let's talk a little bit of AutoCAD and its importance in the industry.
So a million years ago when AutoCAD was very new, the professor who was at Purchase when I got there was a guy named Rick Gray, who has now gone on to do a lot of other things, and recognized early on that AutoCAD was a thing that was going to happen. Although back then, and this is really like version 2 of AutoCAD, it was a 286 computer. We had 3 people sitting around a monitor. You'd hit redraw and you'd sit there and you'd wait. And so it took a while for us to get to a point where we could do it. But um, very early on, it became something where we were like, oh, you can actually do drawings at scale on a computer. And up to then, most of the things were like generic CAD and a few other pieces of software. They were good for schematics, but they weren't good for actual scale drawings. And so uh, another student from Purchase and I were working at Showtech, and we were like, there's this thing called AutoCAD. And so they had been using generic to do schematics, but Rusty and I started doing draftings for real using AutoCAD, which was back then it was a pen plotter, and it would take you like 45 minutes to do a drawing on the plotter. But it was great because it was very fun to watch the pens. Actually, you could do different line weight pens, and it would draw them out. But it would literally work its way through the entire drawing. So it could take, the more lines you had on the drawing, the longer it took to draw. It's not like the inkjets now, where they just feed through. But we were working on a project that was going to Machusta called Metamorphosis, and it was a series of ellipses. It was a big ellipse footprint, and then there were all these ellipses around it. And the folks upstairs that were drafting by hand came downstairs and said, "Can you draw an ellipse with that thing?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. What do you want?" Then we drew the axis and drew the minor and major axis, and then we arrayed. I was able to array around it the other ellipses, and within 6 months, they had converted over to Showtech. Showtech had converted over to AutoCAD, and we were one of the first shops in the country to actually switch over. And it was pretty quick to get people to the point where they were able to use it sufficiently, and then over time, you added a couple of plotters, and then finally the inkjets came out, and it was a much faster proposition. But it was interesting to see there was hesitation, and then suddenly it was like the switch went, and then the other shops in the area realized that this was an advantage that the folks at Showtech had, and they also were interested in doing it. So they adopted AutoCAD as well. That's how it quickly switched over, and now it's moved on where there's this big debate over whether, which software you should use. Is it AutoCAD 3D? Is it Inventor? Is it this, that, and the other? I'm always like, well, it doesn't matter what software you use. If you can't produce a good drawing, it doesn't matter. That
Right.
seems to get lost on a lot of people.
You can do it by pen and pencil. I'm a big Inventor fan, but
Oh, yeah.
let's not go there.
Well, it's funny to this day at Purchase, we still require everybody to learn how to hand draft before they move on to AutoCAD because, drafting is really a thinking process. And I teach what I teach in terms of drafting is the idea that drafting is really like a graphic novel. You're laying out for the person who's receiving the drawing, the process and a story of how you get from basic materials to the finished product. And so the idea is, how do you lay the plate out? How do you get the person who's building it or assembling it to where you want them to be? And so it's a matter of, how do you tell that story? And I think if you don't first learn how to think about a drawing and think in that way, if you go straight to CAD, I find often that people just get caught up in the technology of the software as opposed to the understanding of what they're trying to achieve with it. And so that can be, for me, that's a little worrisome. So I'm still a very big believer in the thinking process associated with drafting. And I don't think you get as much time to think when you're using CAD as you do when you're hand drafting. And I think that then transfers over if you move to CAD, which by the time they're juniors, all the students are drafting in CAD anyway. So, but it's that first initial semester or two of actually drafting by hand, I think really kind of ingrains a sense of understanding that you don't get if you just go straight to CAD.
You hit a very important thing, I think, when we're talking about fabrication and in general the process of building something. I think that's why I like Inventor, because at the end of the day you have your materials and it's like a digital Lego, if you
Yeah,
will, or
yep.
your digital shop. I really like that you can choose your threads and your bolts but okay. And then you get your bill of materials, which is wonderful. But whatever I draw and the way I lay it on the paper for someone else to build it, sometimes won't really matter if I don't understand the actual build and the actual place and the actual build process, the actual place where it's going to be both fabricated and later installed. So I think that process it's a very rich process, very, very nice. I don't know.
Well, I actually think it's really critical that people who do technical design and drafting for theater or for what we do in the entertainment industry, that they've actually been in a shop and that they've been frustrated by drawings that you can't assemble or you can't do. You can't get a wrench to. I mean, I've seen some absolutely gorgeous draftings, but they're completely impossible in the real world because they're drawings where like the cable is a pretension cable with terminations on both ends. But in order for it to actually work, it has to be under tension in the system, and you can't get it there before it's like you're missing the middle part. And so one of the things I try to emphasize to my students is every time you've had a problem, every time you've gotten a drawing and you've been jammed up by something, remember that. And then try not to do that to somebody else. It's funny because I mean, I have very good friends who you've interviewed before, Bill Gorland. And it's funny because, he's got guys on his team. They've never been in a space before. And he was doing a welding seminar, a welding symbol seminar. And some of my students were with me and we were with his engineers. And he said, okay, what's wrong with this symbol? And he showed a weld symbol and it was on the inside of a tube. And the engineers all looked at it and, oh, that looks really great. Then one of my students raised their hand and says, well, you'd never be able to get there to make the weld. So I think there's a lot to be said for having, the practical knowledge on top of the actual ability to draft and do things like that. So.
Yeah, I think Lauren and I shared this, and she shared it on the podcast way back, that we both have small hands. And so many times there's just things that even we struggle, but
Yeah.
it's like, okay, who were you thinking was going to assemble this? Or how is it supposed to fit? I think that is like happens to all of us, but just being able to tighten a knot in a bolt and be able to pass a wrench through and a hand through.
Yeah, I mean,
Those little details.
yeah, my favorite are like legs placed in corners of triangles where you can't even feed the bolt into it, let alone get a socket or a wrench to make the bolt. So it's there's a lot of that stuff. And sometimes you're in a situation where it's like you don't think about it, or you're under so much pressure because the folks in the technical design area are frequently getting everything late from further up the food chain because the designs take forever and then the compression of the time cycle. And so you're doing the best you can, but sometimes there's things I just kind of shake my head. It gets to be a little frustrating sometimes.
Eventually, people start to, let's say, specialize. And there's the people that decide they like to draft, and the people that decide they like to be in the shop, the people that decide to be in the venue. Do you think it would be nice for every now and then, especially for the computer guys, to shuffle around?
Absolutely. I mean, it's this interesting challenge because on the one hand, I could graduate 20 draftsmen tomorrow and they'd probably all find work. So, there's this real demand out there for technical designers and people who want to draft. On the other side, they're more valuable if you get their hands dirty and they learn how to do stuff. But it's interesting. We're seeing more of a divide where people are kind of more specialized these days, and it's actually across the industry, where it's like there are people that know just how to do stuff in a theater. There are people that just know how to do stuff in shops. I mean, in the commercial scene shop market, there are people who've worked in scene shops and have never been in a theater. And there have been people in theaters that have never built scenery. And so it's this weird situation where it's like, I've talked to folks I've known for a long time. They don't know what downstage right means. They don't know what a plaster line is, stuff like that, because, it's not something they needed to know, but they're remarkable craftsmen and they can build way, way better than I'll ever be able to. But it is interesting. It's great if you can get that rounding. The difficulty becomes is that the skill of computer drafting is so valuable these days to people because it's so hard to find folks that are really that interested in sitting behind a computer and drafting, that once you find one, you're like, okay, you're locked in the room. Stay there.
Why do you think it's so hard? Sorry. Go on.
Well, it's the right mindset. I mean, there are people that really, I've had students who just absolutely all they ever want to do is sit behind a computer and draft. Has some very successful folks go off, and they've actually started one who started a company where he's got like 4 or 5 people working for him, and they just do drafting for other shops, because the shops aren't always able to handle the capacity that they need in order to do it. A lot of folks are more interested in project management or, going and doing installs or running events and stuff like that. So it's not everybody wants to sit behind a computer all day just drafting technical drawings, but when you find that person that does, they're kind of like a unicorn. And so you don't want to you don't want to get too far. It's like CNC operators these days. If you can find somebody that'll run a CNC table and does a good job with it, they're going to be chained to that CNC table for a long time. So,
well, a CNC operator, you might be able to bring it from a different industry or a technical school.
Right.
But draft people for entertainment specifically.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
But I also think it's a very, very niche. Like, how do you even know that you want to do that? And once you know, how do you become that person?
Well, it's usually through what I love, it's like exposure therapy. When we have students, it's interesting because we give them a lot of range to look at stuff and to do things. And so you really kind of just get a sense from a student. You can really see where their passion is based on where their work is. And we do this portfolio review every semester, and then every student goes through it at the end of the year, but the new students in the fall. And you can really see through the work where their passion is. I lovingly say to my students, you got to more or less be genetically damaged to do what we do, because you kind of have to. It's not something you want to do; it's something you have to do. Because the irony is that the better you do it, the less anybody notices, and the more you're taken for granted. So it's like that with draftsmen. When they're in my class, it becomes pretty clear pretty early on which ones are more interested in production management, which ones are more interested in drafting. There's a rare few who have skills, across the board, but you can definitely get a sense of it, and you can see it in the work, and you can tell the ones that are like really headed down the drafting path because their drafting is, they get very much caught up in all the technical tricks and all the commands and all the things you can do, and you can just see it in their work as they go through. So, and then they usually find work. So
important.
No, yeah. So it's the goal is to graduate folks that are going to be in the industry and have a career. So that's, we're very careful. Like we do a whole thing at the end of the year where we invite a bunch of industry people in to see the graduating class. And it's always interesting for me because while I started the portfolio finale many years ago, usually a lot of the TDPMs by the time we get to that point are already lined up with work and they've already been taken. So it's kind of amusing to see all the people come in, and they'll get some offers. They'll sometimes they'll get some sweeter deals, but it's a lot of the designers and folks like that are in a position where they're probably going to find more work than the TDs because they're already employed by the time they graduate, typically.
To the people out there that are not that familiar with technical theater, what's the important and what does a technical designer or a mechanical designer, what do they do and why is it so important?
Well, it's funny. I do this whole class on the difference between regional and commercial theater. And commercial theater now is so different. The commercial entertainment industry is so different from the regional market. In the regional world, you actually have the title technical director, and that's the person who's probably working with an assistant, and they're drafting everything, and they're managing the process of realizing the scenery for the production. In a lot of commercial shops now, there's a whole technical design department. And that may have somebody who's better at mechanics, but somebody, everybody's doing framing, doing the construction process. And they're the ones that are coming up with the solutions to how you make stuff happen, how you build stuff, how you put pieces of scenery together in a way that allows you to transport it and then reassemble it and make it look like what the designer is after. And it's the technical designer is in an interesting position because they're probably not the project manager. They're probably getting information from a couple of different sources, and then they're working with, what materials were, bid for the show. What's the timeline? What's the production supervisor want in terms of certain things? And so it's about how do you bring all of those pieces together into a coherent product that allows folks to get the outcome that they're looking for when it comes to achieving the designer's view of the world.
It's interesting that you keep mentioning, I guess that's the way your program is structured. So you have the drafters, the TDs, and the PMs. So I guess they all go more or less to the same classes and then end up doing similar but different jobs.
Yeah, I mean, our program is set up so that there's a certain cohort of knowledge that you really need, regardless of which position you're going to be in. And so, our freshmen, for example, they work as crew in all the shops. So they're, TDs are in the costume shop, they're in lighting, they're on paint deck, they're props, they're in the scene shop. And the idea really is, what we do is a collaborative thing. And so if you don't really understand where the other folks are coming from, you can't really appreciate what they need. I always tell the TDs, if you don't involve the scenic artists early on in the process, you're going to give them something they can't do something with. And so, as much as you want to operate in a vacuum, you really have to appreciate the fact that there's a lot of other people that are going to be touching stuff. Back when I ran a set electric shop at Showtech, I always had to go up when they were drafting the scenery and say, okay, so where am I running cable? Where how am I putting fixtures in? And then we would have to have some conversations occasionally, if the time frame allowed it, to make sure that they were actually building things in a way that would allow me to do my part of the job, as opposed to looking at it from the perspective of, well, I just have to draft the scenery. You'll figure out the electrics. But so it was, it's that kind of attitude that we try to do. And if you're a production manager, you don't understand what scenery can do or how to build it. In my opinion, you're not going to be as good because you're not going to be able to solve problems as they come up, or make suggestions, or frankly tell whether somebody's just running a line of BS against, and telling you, oh, it's impossible. And it's like, well, no, actually it's not. So I think it's really important, but we have the flexibility within our program to give you a really solid foundation, but then allow you to follow the path of your passion. So we have folks that are all over the place in a whole range of, positions, because we give them certain skill sets, and then those skill sets are applicable to a whole range of positions within the entertainment industry, whether it's theater. We've got folks in film, TV, live events, the whole kind of gambit of everything that's out there.
And now a note from our sponsor. The StageLync podcast is proud to be sponsored by Clearcom. Clearcom is the leader in voice communications for theater and the performing arts. Call your cues with the simplicity and elegance of Clearcom Intercom solutions. You can find them at clearcom.com. go check them out. So you really think that it's very translatable from just theater, let's say, to in general live entertainment and whatever, and even film and television?
The interesting thing that I've discovered over the years is that the basic concepts are absolutely there across all the boards. What gets really confusing is how the differences in language, in terms of terminology, like if you say duvetine on the East Coast, it's different than duvetine on the West Coast, and it means something different in film than it does in theater. They're very simple things like that. Even the term technical director, which in TV and film has nothing to do with what we do. It has to do with the technology that they're using to do the broadcast. So there's a lot of things that are very specific. I worked with a shop that does a bunch of broadcast television. It's all theater stuff, but they use completely different materials. So it actually took me a while to ramp up. The funny thing is they got a theater project in, and they had me do her work on it in particular because they didn't necessarily understand a lot of the stuff that needed to be done for a Broadway show, which is very different than if you're just going in and doing a broadcast studio and it's not running multiple scenes during the night and has to have stuff flown in order to be able to store backstage because there's no space, and even how to deal with a track and a knife and dog situation in order to get the scenery across the stage. So it was amusing to me because I felt when I first started there completely lost, just learning the technology and the language of what they were using. But at the end of the day, if you're using plexi or you're using plywood, it's ultimately the same realities that are associated with it. And it's just as long as you're learning to think, as opposed to being told this is the only way you can do something, which I've been told about the same thing by many different people with completely different ways of doing this one thing can only be done this way. So it's really about understanding the concepts and the ideas, and then how do you apply it to any given situation.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a trick question just because you brought it up, but I think it's very fitting. So what's a technical director to you? What's a technical director to film? Because I also find that it's not the same thing. A technical director for, even within live entertainment, for regional theater, perhaps Broadway, they're a bit more similar. But then if you go to Vegas or internationally or even in Canada, there's a slight differing understanding.
I have to say, it is like all over the place with what it can mean. On Broadway, there isn't a technical director. The term doesn't exist. Production supervisor was invented for Artie Saccardi when he did Chorus Line. He had been the lead carpenter on it, but he was doing more and more and coordinating stuff. And there had never been anybody before that with that position. And now there's technical supervisors on Broadway, and they kind of are the regional theater equivalent of a production manager, where they deal with the larger overall process associated with getting a show up. But when it comes to scenery construction, in a regional theater, that's the technical director's domain. They are absolutely, in charge of everything. They may even have the props and the scenics under them, as opposed to being separate departments. On Broadway, there is no technical director. There's a shop head. There's the person who runs the shop. There's probably a project manager at the shop that's going to be the interface with the designer, figuring out how the process is going to go through. Then there's the technical designers who are, the CAD jockeys who are sitting back there running the draftings. So it's this very strange difference. And then you have the production carpenter, who's probably as close to a technical director as you're going to get on Broadway, who is making sure that things are going in the direction, but they're not doing the drawings usually. They're usually, interfacing with the shop and saying, well, I want it this way, I want it that way. So it's the model on Broadway. I do a whole breakdown of like the differences in one of my classes between the regional model and the commercial model. And it's a very interesting animal. And then when you get to the situation where you've got, several shops now are full service shops. So they do everything. They build it, they mechanize it, they paint it. But there are still shops. There's, Scenic Art Studios that just does painting. So it's interesting to see how that model has kind of changed over time. Part of it's due to economics, the reality of the business. which is there's not a lot of money building scenery. It's really from the rentals of the automation that you make a lot of money, which is why a lot of the scene shops now have the capacity to build and to automate. And they'll often, I don't want to say they'll give you the scenery for free, but they do not charge the amount that they should for the scenery because they want to get the automation rental.
It's funny because we just had an interview with Garrett Connor, and then so slightly. I mean, I think he'll agree at this point, but not when he started. But we can have that conversation with him later on.
I have to say, it's interesting to have seen how kind of the scale of Broadway has changed over time. I mean, back in the day, if you look at all the Broadway houses from the 1900s, they were really designed. The folks who ran everything, who were the main folks, were the scenic artists. They came over and everything. Scenery back then was basically about building canvas stretchers that were really big, and everything was two-dimensional scenery that was flown in. And so all the centers on the rigging on Broadway houses is very tight because of that. Modern scenery that's three-dimensional or even, built on aluminum or steel tube framing, it's a very different animal from what was back then. And then the dollars associated with the scale of budgets has significantly changed too. So it's a very different animal. We've evolved a long way from, Shakespeare being able to walk out on stage with a branch in his arm saying, "You're in Burnham Wood," and the audience going, "Oh, Burnham Wood. Okay, we know where we are." Now, if you don't put Burnham Wood on stage and every tree is exactly what's in Burnham Wood, you've got audience members going, "Well, that's not Burnham Wood. I can't believe I'm here." So it's a audience have changed, expectations have changed, and so scenery has changed with it.
Yeah, and I'm not just gonna carry on to the next question, because if we start talking video, it's just
Video is a whole other topic.
I really want to talk about or ask you about your Broadway technical theater history project.
So thank you. Yeah. So so I'm a little bit of a history nerd, and so I have a collection of really old stage technology books and old pieces of scenery hardware and stuff like that in my office, crowding my office at work. But one of the things I noticed was, there's not a whole lot of people that know who's backstage. People know actors, people know directors. Designers have started to get some recognition through the Tonys. They'll get featured. You'll get to see them. But the folks behind the scenes, it's interesting. We're our own worst enemies because most of us don't show up in pictures because we don't want to be. We don't have a whole lot of press out there. But there's a very large number of people involved in any single production that goes on Broadway that people typically don't know anything about. And there's way more work backstage than there is on stage in most instances. So one of the things I realized was that for a long time, Broadway was very much about painting scenery. And then with Chorus Line and a couple other big shows like Starlight, it started to become much bigger, more three-dimensional stuff. And the reality is that, the people who were doing it were getting kind of old. And within a small circle, everybody knew them. But outside of that circle, not so much. And so one of the things I noticed was there was not a whole lot of documentation about who actually built scenery, who built scenery, who were the people backstage, the production supervisors, the shop heads, and stuff like that. And so kind of from that, created the Broadway Technical Theater History Project, which has the goal of kind of documenting the history of all the scene shops that worked on Broadway. It's a long process. But then out of that came the Backstage Legends and Masters Award, which was really designed to bring recognition to an individual who typically is not given a Tony or not recognized by the Tonys or Drama Desk or other areas. And it all started with Artie Siccardi. And so Artie was the first recipient of the award. And it really is a way to kind of, enshrine the history of the folks that have done it over the years. So we're up to 10 recipients. We just did our last recipient last spring. So we're in the process of the committee's in the process of trying to figure out who's going to be number 11. But it's been very exciting. And I have to say, when I first started this, I knew a bunch of people I thought who were going to eventually get picked by the committee, but there have been people who I had no idea. And I feel pretty well versed in the history. and then, and then the committee was like, well, we should have, Arnold Abramson. And I was like, who? And he was one of the foremost shop owners and artists of his time. He and Pete Feller Sr., they were really kind of, central to the whole process that back in the day. But, like so many other people who will be forgotten, the goal was to try and kind of preserve some of the folks before they, disappear into the ether so that there'd be this history available for folks.
And where can I take a look at all this information and all this research you've done?
The videos of the awards are actually on the Broadway Technical Theater History Project's webpage, which I think you can get to if you go to the purchase website and you click on the design technology link. It's the BTTHP, I think, is purchase.edu and then / BTTHP, I think, gets you there. But the 10 recipients of the awards are there, and the videos of those award ceremonies are there. The larger site is still under construction, and part of it's just aggregating and getting all the information that we want to put in it. Been doing a bunch of interviews with a bunch of folks, so it's weird for me to be answering questions as opposed to asking them. But it's great to, get a sense of where did people come from? What was their past? The thing I've learned the most is that, recently it's become more and more important for people to have professional training. There's a bunch of folks like Artie, Gino Donovan, and a few others who, just happened to be in the right place at the right time, didn't necessarily know about this as a career path, but were in the, with the right people and learned really amazing stuff on the job, and just were really remarkable people who were able to take those skills and apply them at a time when, the industry, there were no computers, you were still doing, incandescent lighting and, building scenery. And so that generation, which is now, slowly cycling out of the industry, is why you're seeing more and more people coming out of programs like Purchase, NCSA, and a few of the others, where you've really got this skill set that is becoming more and more necessary for a lot of the technical demands of the industry as it is now.
To me, it's also fascinating. Quest's kind of why I pitched to do the podcast at the very beginning. So
No, I think it's great that you're doing this because it really is. I find it fascinating that, everybody sees an actor and says, "Oh, I want to be an actor." And it's kind of like college sports. There's thousands upon thousands of athletes in college sports. Not so many of them are going to make it professionally. The same thing's true about actors. There's an awful lot of people who want to be actors because they see it. There's not a lot of people that know what we do and see it as a pathway towards a career and a lifetime of, really interesting, stimulating, and rewarding work, which is, for me, what it's all about. And, COVID, when it shut down all the after school activities, that was one of the few pathways that many students have in high school to actually learn about this. And so when that shut down, we saw, the application pool just evaporate. And it took, a couple of years after COVID for high school programs to kick back into gear and to really kind of start understanding that people wanted to do theater again. And so that's when we started seeing a lot more applicants, and we're back up. Our freshman and sophomore years now have recovered from COVID, but, we've got small junior and senior classes because they're the folks they were the few folks who were still thinking about theater from that generation that came up. And, it's interesting. I think the challenge of exposing people to what we do and having them understand the career paths and opportunities and the things that you can do with this degree and just really how successful you can be. It's hard to kind of convey that to a wider cohort. So stuff like this is, I think, really good.
I was thinking, or I wonder, as you were talking, whether backstage tours would be more, if they could become more more of a thing and there would be more people. But at the same time, when you do a backstage tour, you see close to nothing of what we do. You just see a backstage. So yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know how can we
it's tough,
bring people in?
and it's also weird because the economic of the arts in a high school are very challenging. So it's a very right now. What frustrates me most is that a lot of the folks are from a very particular section of socioeconomic reality because they have to be at a school that's got enough money that they can actually afford the arts. Unfortunately, there's a lot of places that can't. And then when you get further up into some more of the elite schools, a lot of the students there are not really thinking about what we do, but they also don't really appreciate what it is we do. And I think, everybody kind of sees actors and directors and, even to a certain extent designers, but they never see the technical director. They never see the lead carpenters. They never see the folks doing welding or rigging or all the other stuff that, is associated scuba diving with doing a lot of these shows now. And, how exciting and interesting it is to do. And, you can have a real life. I've graduated a lot of folks who have, careers in the industry. They've got, they've been able to buy houses. They've been married. They have children. It's a little scary that I'm starting to see the children of former students, but having said that, it's
Congratulations.
thanks. It just longevity, but it really is. It's one of those nuts that's very hard to crack, and there's a lot of ways to try to get to it. But it's funny when you look at it, like a one person show has one actor, but there's probably a whole army of technicians that have worked on putting that production on stage. And so
at least the stage manager, sound lights, maybe they'll be the one person, but one person backstage. So you'll have at least 5 people working behind a one person show, at least.
At minimum. Yeah. And it's often even more than that. So, and then when you go out beyond it and you look at the scenery that was built and the wardrobe and all the other stuff, it's a pretty long list of people that are actually making it happen. That's why when the credits roll with the
people, production, creatives.
Yeah. No, it's a fairly, it's a little too much of a secret as far as I'm concerned. It's not as well, broadcast and understood beyond certain circles. There's certain high schools that have really phenomenal theater programs. And we see a lot of kids from those programs apply to purchase and come. But it's sad the state of many high schools, willingness to participate in theater or ability to participate in theater. And it's, in many ways it's a shame because it's a great avenue for a lot of people to have careers and to really improve their world in a way that, you don't have otherwise.
Yeah. You're making me think as well as like we're talking a lot from the US perspective and the Broadway perspective, right? But then you really have one-man shows that are one-man shows, and it's the person that does his design and his costumes, or his or her or their costumes. And they do their entire production pretty much by themselves, whether it's by economical reasons, cultural reasons.
Right.
And then, yeah, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of things to think on and to try to. And I wonder if that process probably takes longer than our timelines when we're talking regional theater or Broadway, right? Like, if I am the one person doing the script, the staging, the design of every single thing, and then making sure, do I need a mic? Am I using a mic? Am I using a stage? Am I on the streets? Where am I? And then dealing with permits and dealing with tickets or no tickets or marketing. And I wonder how a timeline looks for that person.
Well, it's interesting because I'm probably quoting the wrong thing, but there's actually a theorem that basically things will expand to fill the amount of time they have.
Sure.
And I point this out to like everybody because I've done productions that took 2 weeks. and I've done the same production and it took 2 months. And I think I was as busy on both of them. So it is this magical elasticity in our industry where if you say you've got X amount of time, you either use that time or you find other things to fill in if you think you're going to have extra time. It's funny how it's rare that you're way ahead of schedule and you're done early. But I lovingly refer to it as the Scotty principle, which was this on Star Trek. There's a character, Scotty, who's the chief engineer, and he was having a conversation with somebody else, and it's like, well, how much time do you think it's going to take? And he told him how much time. He says, well, so how much time is it really going to take? And he said, well, that's how much time I think it's going to take. And Scotty said, no, you never tell them the exact amount of time, because if you do, how can you be a miracle worker? So I always find that interesting in our industry. It's like, yeah, well, you have 2 weeks to do this entire show, and somehow it manages to happen. Having a curtain, having a deadline for that audience to walk in and see it is a very motivating factor, and it can be very high stress. I'm not gonna lie, it could be, but once it's up and running, and once the audience is there and they're reacting to what you've produced, you can take a step back, and that's where the real enjoyment becomes. When you see something go from sticks of lumber on the floor to being a fully realized production with actors on stage and an audience enjoying it, brings you back every time.
Then what would you say is your favorite thing about your job?
Learning. I have been doing this for a really long time, and I have always learned something new every year, and if not every day that I work on something. That's the greatest thing about it is, if you think about it, what we're doing is thousands of years old. I mean, what was going on in the Coliseum was theater. They were doing water shows back then. The resources and who does the work is a little different. But it's all founded on the same ideas and the same concepts, but it's always different. And so I just absolutely love the opportunity to learn. And I've been, learning my entire career. And I think it's one of the things that's most interesting to me about teaching is that I learn something almost every class. Either it's something I didn't think of before when I'm explaining a drawing or doing something on the whiteboard, or a student will mention something that they had experienced once somewhere in a particular situation. Like, now that's something I didn't think about. And then you can grow. And so I just love learning. And this industry allows you to do that if you're willing to always learn something new.
I love it. I agree. And if you could change anything, either about your job or the industry, what would you change?
It's the one thing I think that would be nice in the industry in particular, but it's not going to happen, is for the technical end to be included in a way that isn't, you're just a bunch of hammer jockeys, and knuckle draggers who don't really bring anything to the table other than work on the show. I think there's a certain level of appreciation for the artists, for the designers and the director, and I think they're they're always referred to as the creative team, and then you leave the technical people off of that, and that part bothers me because I've always said, if you want to see an ugly show, hire a bad TD, and I think that the kind of reality is that the TDs and the carpenters and the technical staff often, regardless of department, kind of get taken for granted on a certain level. And I think what I'd love to see is a little bit more appreciation of the folks backstage and what it is they really do. There are some folks I've worked with who are on stage and actors who just absolutely get it, and they are just amazing to work with. And I've had other people that are not so much. And they think that you're just there to be servants and to provide anything that they need. And I think it's unfair to the craftsmen and women and all the people that are backstage that are doing really incredible work, most often working long hours that nobody ever sees, that they don't get the kind of level of recognition, which is frankly why I started the Backstage Legends and Masters Award, to try and kind of bring that spotlight a little bit more on folks like Artie and Gene and Freddie, so they would, outside of just the folks who know, get more recognition for the work that they do. Because I think that, to me, is, I think, the one short-sighted part of this industry is the kind of taking for granted of that whole part of it.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for sharing with us tonight and with our audience. And thank you to our audience for listening. And make sure to check Dan's project on the Purchase website and our website, which is www.stagelync.com. And let us know what you think.
Thank you for listening to the StageLync podcast. StageLync is an online platform that gives you access and connection to the live performing arts. As a guest, you can read about live performing arts from across the globe and gain insights from performers and artists on stage and all the amazing people who work behind the curtain. If you are an industry professional, StageLync Pro offers jobs, networks, and career support tools, and you can build your own professional profile on the site. As a StageLync podcast listener, you are eligible for 20% off your StageLync Pro membership. Visit us at stagelync.com, and when joining, use the code SLPodcast. StageLync, that's StagelYnc.com.